Society tells you that marriage is the ultimate sign of emotional maturity, that choosing to stay unmarried means something is missing in you. But what if the opposite is true? What if the people who choose not to marry aren't running from commitment, but toward a version of themselves that most people never meet? I'm going to show you what's actually happening in your brain when you choose to walk this path alone, and by the end, you'll see that you're not broken, you're wired differently. Let's start with what you already know. You felt it at family gatherings. The questions, the concerned looks, the subtle implication that your life is still waiting to begin, that until you find the one, you're somehow incomplete. It's not just your family, it's everywhere. The movies you watch, the songs you hear, the timelines you scroll, all of it quietly reinforcing the same script. Love, marriage, stability, meaning. And here's what's fascinating. That script isn't just cultural, it's neurological. Your brain is hardwired for tribal validation. A 2016 study from UCLA found that social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex lights up when you're excluded from the group. Your brain literally experiences isolation as a threat. So when people around you marry, settle down, and you don't, your nervous system registers it, not as freedom, as deviation. But deviation isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's just different wiring. Here's something I've noticed over the years. The people who genuinely choose not to marry aren't commitment phobes. They're autonomy-driven, and there's a psychological distinction here that most people miss. Commitment phobes avoid because they fear. Autonomy-driven people choose because they protect. Let me explain. In 2012, researchers at the University of Rochester identified two fundamental psychological needs: autonomy and relatedness. Most people balance these, but some people. They're wired with a higher baseline need for autonomy. It's not a wound, it's a temperament. Your brain produces dopamine when you have control over your environment. When you make your own decisions, when your life feels like yours. Marriage, for most people, creates a shared decision-making structure, and for many that's comforting. But for you, it feels like friction, like wearing someone else's skin. I've come to believe this isn't selfishness, it's self-knowledge. You're not rejecting love. You're rejecting the scaffolding society built around it. There's a story we've been told since childhood. The idea that we're incomplete until we find our other half. Plato wrote about it, the myth of soulmates, two halves searching for wholeness. But neuroscience tells a different story. A landmark study from Harvard in 2019 followed over 15,000 adults for nearly 2 decades. The researchers wanted to know, does marriage make people happier? The answer was more nuanced than anyone expected. Marriage increased happiness. But only for people who already had low baseline autonomy and high social dependency. For people with high autonomy and intrinsic purpose, marriage had almost no effect on long-term well-being. In some cases, it decreased it. Let me say that again. For some people, marriage doesn't complete them. It compresses them. Your brain already produces oxytocin through friendships, creative work, solitude, nature. You don't need a spouse to access bonding chemicals. You've built other pathways. And that's not a deficit. That's architecture. Here's where it gets deeper. Marriage isn't just a relationship. It's an identity merger. When two people marry, their brains begin to sync. A 2017 study from the University of California found that long-term partners start to share cognitive patterns. Decision-making becomes collaborative. Memories blur. I becomes we. For many, this is beautiful. But for you, it might feel like erasure. From my perspective, people who choose not to marry aren't afraid of intimacy. They're protective of identity. You've spent years becoming someone, building a mind, curating a life. And somewhere deep in your nervous system, there's a quiet alarm that says, if I merge, I disappear. This isn't narcissism, it's integrity. You've noticed that when you're in relationships, parts of you go silent, not because you're being controlled, but because partnership requires negotiation, and negotiation requires compromise. And compromise for you feels like amputation, so you choose wholeness over halves. But let's be honest, This path isn't without cost, because here's what society doesn't tell you. Meaning doesn't come from freedom alone. It comes from constraint. Psychologist Barry Schwartz called it the paradox of choice. The more freedom you have, the more paralyzed you become. Too many options. Too many possible selves. Marriage, in a way, is a chosen constraint. It narrows your future. And that narrowing, paradoxically, creates direction. When you choose not to marry, you keep all the doors open. But open doors don't always lead somewhere. Sometimes they just echo. I've noticed this in my own thinking. The people who thrive unmarried aren't the ones who avoid commitment. They're the ones who commit to something else. A craft. A mission. A question. A question. Marriage gives people a shared story. But you have to write your own. And that requires something most people never develop, authorial discipline. You have to create meaning without the default narrative. So what does all this mean for you? It means you're not avoiding life. You're living a different equation. While most people outsource their existential purpose to partnership, you're forced to find it within. That's harder, but it's also deeper. You're not leaning on someone else's nervous system for regulation. You've learned to self-soothe, to sit with silence, to build a life that doesn't collapse when someone leaves. That's not loneliness. That's resilience. A 2020 study from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people with high autonomy and low relational dependency showed greater psychological flexibility. They adapted faster, recovered quicker, suffered less identity disruption during major life changes because they never built their sense of self around someone else. You've been doing the inner work most people avoid. So here's what I want you to understand. You're not broken. You're not missing something. You're not emotionally stunted or afraid of vulnerability. You're someone who looked at the default path and said, that's not for me. And that takes a kind of courage most people never access. The courage to disappoint, to deviate, to trust your own wiring over the world's expectations. Society will keep telling you that marriage is the milestone. But you know better. Your milestone is becoming someone you don't need to escape from. It seems to me that the people who choose not to marry aren't rejecting love. They're rejecting the idea that love requires fusion. You can care deeply, connect deeply, even commit deeply, without dissolving. And maybe that's the version of love the world isn't ready for yet. But you are.